Captain Midnight.
This video is brought to you by Raycon. So, I love the Syfy Channel. In fact, it's one of the few cable channels whose new programming I always keep an eye on. And back when watching reruns was a thing, it was always nice to flip over to it and find a reliably funny episode of Futurama, or maybe even a Twilight Zone playing. But when I say I love the Syfy Channel, I want to make it clear that I also kind of hate it with a burning passion. Alright, that's probably not fair, but maybe you understand where I'm coming from. See, loving the Syfy Channel is kind of like what I imagine loving the Cleveland Browns is like. You're just stuck in this constant rebuilding year, where you tell yourself, okay, next year is when they'll be in a really good position to turn this thing around. They've got some new talent, things are looking interesting, and no. Even the good stuff on Syfy tends to go a little unnoticed by the general public just because no one takes it seriously anymore. I genuinely think that Syfy has done some good stuff in the past decade that would have gained a lot more traction if it was on Netflix or Hulu or really anywhere but Syfy. Traditional cable channels are dying, and they're dying fast. Honestly, I have pretty mixed feelings about that. So in this video, I want to talk about Syfy and the ups and downs of a channel that I was always cheering for better or for worse.
So you got sucked down a wormhole and shot to the other side of the universe? Well, here's your helpful guide. Run, Scoot the Moose!
Just like I've always had a love-hate relationship with the channel itself, I feel like Syfy has always had kind of a weird love-hate thing going on with the genre it named itself after, but maybe I should go back to where it started. See, in 1989, there was a pair of married lawyers in Boca Raton, Florida, named Mitchell Rubenstein and Lori Silvers. They both had a lot of clients in the entertainment industry and could see the cable gold rush coming. The late 80s was kind of the Wild West in terms of cable. It was new, it was shiny, and everyone knew there was lots of money to be made. They both had a mutual love for sci-fi and felt that cable was lacking a channel that catered to it 24/7, so that simple idea was born. USA Network stepped in and bought the concept, and on September 24th, 1992, the Syfy Channel was launched. The weird spelling wouldn't come until much later, and look, right from the start, it seems like it was easy to tell this was a cheap operation. But I would say in a very lo-fi, charming way. Their first original programming, if you can even really call it that, was called FTL Newsfeed. These minute-long interstitials that would play during commercial breaks and pretended to be news reports from the future. But the big news for Syfy fans wasn't the original programming, it was the reruns and the mission statement of the channel. Right away, Syfy tried to prove its genre credentials by hiring Gene Roddenberry and Isaac Asimov, two of science fiction's biggest names, to sit on its advisory board. Sadly, both men passed away by the time Syfy launched, but having them there in the first place was the channel trying to make one thing clear. Syfy was made for science fiction fans by science fiction fans. Star Trek was there from the start, being constantly rerun. The classic Universal horror films, Rod Serling's Night Gallery, were just a few of the things that filled out the schedule. Not only that, but early on they made the very smart move to bring over the cult hit Mystery Science Theater 3000. Before that, it had aired on public broadcasting in Minnesota and on Comedy Central, and it was the perfect show for them for an obvious reason. It was incredibly cheap. See, the channel had a lot of credibility with fans and a great back catalog of old sci-fi and horror to tap into, but basically no money to make originals of their own. MST3K was an exception because, it was a guy and some puppets watching some movies, not exactly a Game of Thrones level budget. Eventually, that changed a little, giving way to shows like Lex and Farscape. And look, I understand that to many viewers now, these shows probably look pretty dated, especially Lex, but I really respect how ambitious they were, and especially in the case of Farscape, I think they ended up overcoming their budget limitations and creating something really great. Farscape is a deeply nerdy show, and a lot of people will be put off by the puppets. I know I kind of was initially, but after really finding itself about halfway through season 1, I'd say it evolved into the most purely enjoyable show Syfy ever made. It has this charming ragtag crew that so many sci-fi shows after it would try and usually fail to replicate in the years after. The next few years would see some flawed but interesting and worthwhile shows like Andromeda, and a show Syfy brought over from Showtime, Stargate SG-1. Honestly, I was never too much of a Stargate guy, but this obviously paid off big for the channel, as pretty soon spin-offs were made and it became their most consistent franchise. In the early 2000s, things seemed to be going great for Syfy. Not only had their choice to invest in Stargate paid off, they also made a miniseries that most would consider the best thing the channel ever made, Battlestar Galactica. Don't get me wrong, there's plenty of sci-fi shows I like, but BSG feels different. There's a cheapness to a lot of their other shows, something that I don't mind if the writing is good, but the production here felt on a whole other level. The cast was filled out with old pros and exciting new faces, the effects were really great by the TV standards of the time, and it had a sense of gritty realism that felt so fresh in a TV space opera. Many will probably say the show went off the rails in the last season or two, and I'd probably even agree with that. But honestly, I just don't care that much. Because when BSG was good, it was easily some of the best science fiction ever put on television. With the huge success of the show, it felt like the Syfy Channel had finally arrived. They'd placed a big bet on hard sci-fi that touched on many of the themes and ideas that people like Asimov and Roddenberry were obsessed with, and it had paid off big. So the next question was, what do they do with that success? And their answer kind of turned out to be to tear apart their reputation bit by bit until there was nothing left. See, BSG may have been racking up the respect in the award nominations, but it turned out the channel saw their future in a very different kind of show. 2006 saw the start of Eureka, a very light sci-fi comedy about a wacky small town. It did well in the ratings, was fairly well liked, and importantly, it was much cheaper than a show like Battlestar. Pair that with the massive success of Ghost Hunters, a cheap reality show, and the executives saw a different way forward for the channel. Enough risk-taking on expensive and heady projects like Battlestar Galactica. Why do that when you can make inexpensive, low-stakes, USA-style shows with a little helping of science fiction and extremely cheap reality shows where people pretend to see ghosts over and over again? 2010 was the year that trend really hit its peak. Both Ghost Hunters and its spin-off Ghost Hunters International were going strong. While the expensive and convoluted but very ambitious Battlestar prequel Caprica was cancelled after just one season. Soon after, Syfy would start airing pro wrestling and making even more reality shows. Some, to be fair, were actually pretty good, like Face Off, where makeup artists compete in designing their own aliens and monsters, which might be my favorite reality show ever made. Overall though, I think the damage was done. Syfy was no longer a channel that people thought of as wanting to produce great space operas, or even harder sci-fi like their Outer Limits reboot. It had gone all in on reality shows and mediocre, low-stakes dramedies. That was true of a lot of channels in the early 2010s, but I feel like Syfy's reputation got even harder, thanks to, well, you know. Sharknado was a surprise hit for Syfy. It trended everywhere and was legitimately kind of a phenomenon. It was also the single worst thing to ever happen to the Syfy Channel. Sharknado's whole shtick was that it was fun to mock, thanks to its ridiculous story and low-budget production. And Syfy went all in on this formula, buying tons of awful made-for-TV movies from Asylum, trying to recapture that success. And it worked, like for a while, but I don't think it was worth what they ended up doing to the brand's reputation. People no longer thought of Syfy as the channel invested in making great science fiction like Battlestar Galactica, but a novelty brand proudly associating themselves with airing just complete garbage.
Lasers ready.
Where are the humans?
They are on the Universal Studios tour.
Eventually, Syfy tried to do a 180, going back to its roots with shows like The Expanse. And creatively, I actually think it worked. It took me a bit to warm up to The Expanse, but once I did, I really got into it. It gained a loyal fan base and garnered some of their best reviews in years. And then it got really low ratings, because no one was looking to Syfy for quality shows anymore. They canceled The Expanse only for it to be saved by Amazon, where it's currently still running. I think that says a lot about where Syfy is right now. Their best show did a lot better when they weren't associated with the channel. And The Expanse isn't the only case of this happening. You look at a show like Channel Zero, which was really ambitious and really interesting, and it had to be saved by Shudder after Syfy just tossed it to the curb. I know Iona Earp and the recently ended Magicians got a lot of traction with fans, but even there, those shows were constantly on the edge of cancellation, with Earp actually being cancelled only to come back at a reduced budget. And while I don't mean this to come off as a huge knock on these shows, they're obviously very low budget compared to the flagship shows of most other cable channels. Like, I loved the Magicians novels, and watching the pilot of the show, I was kind of shocked by how sparsely populated and low rent the locations were here. I'm willing to cut genre TV a lot of slack when it comes to budget, but Syfy does themselves no favors by making all of their projects as cheap as possible. And now they just seem to be in limbo, constantly canceling things and trying to figure out what exactly the Syfy Channel brand is in 2020. Their attempt to get back into space operas with the charming but also very cheap looking Vagrant Queen went away after only 1 year. To me, that show got better and better as it went on, and they didn't give it a chance to pick up any fans on streaming. Like, if it ever lands on Netflix or something, I think it could do really well, and most people who watch it won't have seen it until after it's already been cancelled. It just feels like the whole channel is flailing around, trying desperately for a massive Battlestar-style hit. And honestly, I just don't see that happening. It's not 2003 anymore, or even 2010 when The Walking Dead took the world by storm. The big buzzworthy hits are mostly on streaming now, leaving Syfy to either get folded into a streaming service like FX is in the process of doing with Hulu, or simply fading away, trying to get the attention of mainstream audiences with cheaper and cheaper shows every year, until eventually the ship is finally just underwater. It's kind of a sad fate for a channel that has made some things that I love, and that I always thought had huge potential. But they've devalued the brand name so much that I'm just not sure it's worth salvaging. I'm sure people will be making great science fiction on TV for a long time to come, but my guess is they'll be doing it without Syfy. A few videos ago, I talked about my Raycon earbuds, which I had just received. And now, about a month later, I can pretty easily say these things are my favorite earbuds I've ever owned. They sent me a pair of their everyday E25s to test out, and now I don't want to wear anything else. I've had some trouble with earbuds in the past, but these fit my ears really comfortably. They have great audio quality, and they come with 6 different gel tips just to make sure you get the fit that you want. Plus, they can make calls and are water resistant, which has been great because I live in Seattle and it rains kind of a lot. Oh, and the latest model is their best one yet, with 6 hours of playtime, really easy and fast Bluetooth pairing, more bass, and a more compact design that gives you a nice noise isolating fit. Now you can even get them in a bunch of different colors, all at half the price of other premium earbud brands for that same high quality sound. To try them out and get 15% off, go to buyraycon.com/midnight. That's buyraycon.com/midnight.
Here's a special tip for the fellas and girls who have not already joined Captain Midnight's new 1940 Flight Patrol. You'd better hurry up and join at once because there's a big adventure ahead. The thing to do now is to get started because we're going to have not only barrels of fun, but loads of free gifts and prizes too.